Except I don't think the Chief Minister is here today. Fabian Picardo is here today, and he's a little bit out of his comfort zone because he's not going to talk about any of the issues that he has a team with him for. He's going to talk a little bit about himself. And it's not going to be about anything that's happened in the past year, because I'm going to go back to the very beginning and to how it all began, to try and share with you what it was that put me on a road and, thankfully, took me to a destination which is where I am today. And I want to go back to that first moment. And it starts with a very old lady telling me a story about something that happened in Spain, not in Gibraltar. Quite close in La Linea. It's a story probably most of you have heard of, about a doctor who was shot because he used to care for working people in the 1920s and 30s in Spain. And cut forward to somebody who was involved in setting up the Housewives Association, teaching me about having to defend your ideas. That's my grandmother and my mother, and those are the people who formed me. And informing me, what they gave me was the desire to be involved, the desire to have a view, to feel about something that I had to defend, that I couldn't just allow it to be something that others talked about and that others made their minds up about, that I had to be involved too. And of course, that pointed me towards the priesthood, which was my first chosen profession. When I was that high and I used to wear my white cassock and go into the church every Sunday, I decided that this was exactly what I wanted to do for a living. I wanted to put on this garb, and I was able to say the Mass off by heart by the time I was 7 or 8. And, you know, I had an opinion about religion then. It was something that was very easy and very clear to a 7-year-old boy. And this didn't go away in a moment. This stayed with me for quite a while. So my first chosen profession was priest. You know, I developed. I don't think it was a church that changed. I think it was me. I went for another P straight after that, and I was going to be a pilot. I was going to be a pilot of commercial airlines. And you know, at one stage, because I enjoyed doing these memory tricks, I would sit in front of a book on the Concorde, and I'd read exactly which button you had to press and when, how to make the nose come up, etc. All of that was torn asunder by a teacher telling me that I wore glasses and I therefore couldn't be a commercial airlines pilot. You know how disappointed I am these days, and perhaps some of my political opponents as well, every time I go on a plane and I see a pilot with glasses. If only Father Picardo could fly the Concorde with his glasses on, you know, life would have been so different for so many others. So my dreams of taking over the Vatican state shattered, and my idea of flying across the Atlantic at the speed of sound also shattered. I was once in a classroom with a gentleman by the name of Albertanino. Some of you may have heard me say this before, and I have a reputation which I don't deserve for being argumentative. And I think that we were dealing with pronouns in Spanish, and I thought you could do them in another way. And Albertanino absolutely rightly said to me when I was about 13 or 12 and a half years old, listen, Fabian, if you want to argue, why don't you become a lawyer and charge for it instead of doing it in my classroom? Shut up. Well, actually, I shut up because I was thinking that if I could actually charge people for arguing with them, this was a panacea. This was even better than the priesthood and the aeroplanes. So I moved on with that idea, and I went home one day and I said to Mum, you know, I think I want to be a lawyer. And I think I just said that and then walked off and continued playing with the Smurfs and doing whatever else I was doing that day. And of course, you plant a seed in my mother's head and it grows. No sooner had my guide to the Middle Temple arrived, not something which I had ordered, but something that she thought it might be useful for me to read about. I soon was working out that solicitor's one thing and barrister's another thing, and I found myself ushered into an office on hospital ramp, library ramp, sorry. I'd been there before. It was a place where Reggie Valladino had his clinic. And upstairs, there were men in suits. There was one particular man in a suit sitting behind a desk, and his name was Joshua Hassan. He'd been my mother's boss for some years. My mother had been his secretary before I was born. And Joshua Hassan had Magda call him and say, my son wants to be a lawyer. And of course, he remembered Javier, my brother, and thought Javier, who would then have been about 24, had just returned from the United Kingdom looking for a job. So imagine his surprise when something about this high walked in. And my mum said, can you tell him what you've done? Can you tell him how to become a lawyer? And so he started to talk. And I'd seen there was a gentleman outside who was just sitting there next to his secretary. That was his bodyguard. This was an important man. I knew we'd talked about him in school. And I came away from there realizing that the law could be about more than just applying rules. It could be about making them. And so from priest to pilot to politician. And walking out of Joshua Hassan's office really was quite an inspiration. And thinking that this man had achieved so much for us and understanding and reading about him really put me on a road. Isn't it ironic that I'm standing here, Chief Minister representing the Gibraltar Socialist Labour Party, and the man who first put me on the road was the leader of the Association for the Advancement of Civil Rights. Those two parties were at loggerheads for many years. But it doesn't take away from the person and what each of us has brought to this place. So, embarked on this journey now as a politician, I started to try and understand how I could emulate, try to achieve the sort of trajectory that this man had achieved. And of course, the minute you do that, you realize that you don't stand a chance. I mean, nobody's going to give me 40 years in the job. Neither do I want them. And the hardship that our community went through at the time that Joshua Hassan was leading it is not, thank God, something that we are ever going to see again, I hope. So after that, I started to try and understand what my position is politically on all these issues. And something happened in 1988. We had a change of government. The government I had known since I was born in 1972, the AACR won an election in 1972, having been out of government for 3 years, was going to change. My brother thought this was really exciting. My parents thought it was terrifying. Joshua Hassan was going, then Adolfo, the AACR, and the communist was coming in. Oh my goodness, how time changes things. And I had to make up my mind. What do I feel about this? I found myself excited at the prospect of what was happening. And even my parents, I think like many people, started to become excited about what was happening. I remember going up the rock. I used to be collected from school by my dad, and we'd go and collect my mum, and seeing the landmass of Gibraltar growing every day as the reclamation happened in 1988. I could hear arguments about the economy and where it was going and how it was changing. And so, slowly, in my adolescence, I start to realize that I sympathize a lot with the arguments that are being put by the man with the mustache. And I try and understand more about what's happening there. Other things happen about that time. In 1990, we start to see the nascent steps of self-determination and National Day. I go off to university. I start to study law and use the law to try and understand the politics of Gibraltar, the international law, and how that affects us and the arguments that are being made and are not being made. And then from about 1991, I start to become more involved. I go in a program that a man called Clive Galt is organizing to talk about being a student in the United Kingdom with some friends. One of them, David Bocino, who subsequently also gets involved in politics. Clive enjoys the program and decides that instead of doing us on why you're studying and what to look out for in the UK, he wants to organize a program about what young people think about politics. So he gets us back together. And in the invited audience, a program called Live from the Rock, which in my mind is always Clive from the Rock, because it was all about Clive, there's a guy I've never met before called Joseph Garcia. And that night, we get talking. It's 1991. If you want to know what I look like in 1991, go on my Facebook profile, because I decided that that's the weight I wanted to be remembered by, and how I wanted you to think of me. And I start talking about politics with Joseph. We start the process of forming a political party. And that political party at that stage really does become two men and a fax machine. It's him and me giving people our views with an executive committee that meets once a month. But I was a student, I had time, and Joseph was working, and I'd just turn up and sit in his office, and we'd think of things that we thought we had to talk about. We were such an utter nuisance, an utter nuisance. I mean, I remember being interviewed by Richard Cartwright, and I think that's one of the interviews that you can see now online, about potholes outside South Pavilion Road. And that's where Joseph lived. And there were big potholes, and this had to be dealt with in a particular way. And that was the sort of politics that we were dealing with then. That was 1991. The party was formed on the 9th of December, 1991. You know what happened since then. I've lived my life, my political life, in public since then. And then 2011 happened. 2011, I got divorced, I got engaged, moved home, all of the things that are supposed to be really, really stressful, became the leader of the Communist Party, as my mother would have called it in 1987, of the Gibraltar Socialist Labour Party, got married, and then, in the room next door, in the Charles Hunt room, not at 7 in the morning when everybody who was outside this place thought we had won the election, not at 7 in the morning, we hadn't won yet. There were still 1 or 2 tables to count, and there were 400 votes between us. But close on 7:45, Joe Holliday was in that room. He'd been Deputy Chief Minister for 8 years. Peter Caruana was there. He'd been Chief Minister for 16 years. They were counting the spoiled ballots. We were getting very, very close. There was almost nothing in it. 7:45, Peter came around the table, stretched out his hand and said, "Congratulations, you've done it." Maybe in 4, 8, 16 years' time, I'll come and tell you about my time at Convent Place. That day, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I hate talking about myself. I hate it. It's so easy to talk about gay marriage or anything else. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with my wife, Joseph, and Penny, 20 years to the day, the road to Convent Place reached its destination. Tocar trompeta ya.